This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 818 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into the transactions this week, I want to send another reminder about the Late Round Fantasy Football Patreon. With the Patreon, you get live stream Q&As with yours truly, weekly rankings and tiers, rest of season rankings and tiers, a great Discord community, and much more. You can learn more about it over on lateround.com. Let's get to these transactions. Buy Jerome Ford and add Kareem Hunt. Now, like most buy and sell transactions, there's some nuance to this one. Back when Nick Chubb suffered his season-ending injury, one of the biggest question marks about Jerome Ford was how he'd react to a really tough stretch of games. Chubb got hurt in week 2 against Pittsburgh. From week 3 to week 6, the Browns would face the Titans, Ravens, and 49ers. That wasn't the easiest schedule in the world. Ford has come through with 3 top 24 performances at running back during that stretch. And moving forward, Cleveland has a much easier schedule. Over their next 3 games, they get the Colts, Seahawks, and Cardinals. Those are 3 teams that rank as top 11 favorable matchups for running backs in adjusted points allowed. From now through the end of the year, Cleveland running backs have the second best schedule according to my numbers. That's a big reason to want both Jerome Ford and Kareem Hunt on your roster right now. But I know what you're thinking. JJ, why should we be buying into Jerome Ford after what Kareem Hunt did in week 6? And the reason I think that you might be able to is because the manager, the person who has Jerome Ford, they might be a little bit worried. If you're trading for Ford at his pre-week 6 price tag, this might be more of a hold transaction as opposed to a buy. But people with Jerome Ford might be a little bit nervous right now. Because in week 6, Kareem Hunt had 16 PPR points. Jerome Ford had 11. And there are signs that Hunt's going to take on a decent role in that Cleveland backfield. He saw his route participation go from about 15% pre-week 5 bye to 33% in week 6. And then Jerome Ford's ended up dropping from about 60% to 33%. That's not some insignificant thing. And it makes Kareem Hunt someone that you want on your roster. But Ford still ended up seeing 58.6% of the team's running back rushes in week 6. That was his highest running back rush share of the season. And let's just try to be objective here. We're working off of a 1-game sample. This trend of Kareem Hunt seeing more work through the air, seeing more work in this backfield, it's not really confirmed yet. It's only been 1 game. And as we know, a Kareem Hunt injury would really unleash Jerome Ford. There's contingent upside. But I do think that if you're going to trade for Jerome Ford right now, it's not the cleanest transaction in the world. It's not some obvious screaming buy. It's one where you're buying into Cleveland's upcoming schedule. And it's one where you're buying into the potential that your league mate is nervous about Ford. If that latter point is not true, if your league mate is not worried about Jerome Ford, then trading for Ford right now, probably not worth your time. But you can still add Kareem Hunt off waivers this week. Essentially, if you can trade some bench assets for Jerome Ford right now, I'd be all for it. I'd lean into this idea that Kareem Hunt may take over this backfield because the schedule's good and Jerome Ford has not been bad since Nick Chubb's gone down. Add Devin Singletary. So Dameon Pierce's rough season got even rougher in week 6. He hadn't seen big target share numbers all season long, but he was at least averaging a running back rush share per game rate of about 72% from week 1 to week 5. In week 5 specifically, Dameon Pierce saw every single Houston Texans running back rush. That all changed in week 6. Pierce saw his percentage of running back rushes fall to just 50% against the Saints. And he didn't see a single target. His route participation was the lowest of his season. That's because Houston decided to use Devin Singletary more. Singletary hit season highs in running back rush share, snap share, target share, and route participation. That's noteworthy. And it's especially noteworthy when you consider that the Texans were in a neutral and positive game script. That type of game script historically had favored Dameon Pierce. But this week it favored Devin Singletary. Now maybe this will end up being an outlier for this backfield. But it could also be the start of Devin Singletary being a more valuable fantasy asset than Dameon Pierce. Now this week they're on a bye, but Singletary is definitely worth the add through the bye. And it's nice that they have that bye week because you might be able to get him cheaper. Sell Bijan Robinson. Bijan Robinson started his season off really strong. He scored 13.6 and 28.9 PPR points. But he's been pretty average since then. He's averaged just 10.5 PPR points per game. A big problem for him is Antonio Gibson. Gibson's basically been playing a receiving role out of that backfield all season long. Now, Robinson did hit a season-high 50% route participation in Week 6, but he's yet to see a double-digit percentage target share in a game all season. That's obviously a problem, as is the fact that Washington is one of the tougher schedules from here on out, according to adjusted fantasy points allowed for running backs. And in the fantasy playoffs, specifically in weeks 15 through 17, they get the Rams, Jets, and 49ers. Those aren't very desirable matchups. I think Robinson should be fine as like an RB3, maybe a low-end RB2 with some spiked weeks. But if someone in your league is willing to pay up after a reasonable Week 6 outing, I'd be open to trading Bijan Robinson away. Add Curtis Samuel. So if you listen to this podcast and you listen to the Sleeper Show, then you might already have Curtis Samuel on your roster because he was featured on the Sleeper Show last week. He had a nice slot matchup against Atlanta, and he came through with a 4-catch, 42-yard, 1-touchdown performance. Samuel's peripherals aren't amazing. He's seen a 15.5% target share in the season. Over his last 3, that target share has been 18%. But the thing is, Washington's been the third pass-heaviest team in football this year. So that target share, that 15, 16, 17% target share, that's on a good number of pass attempts. Now, we shouldn't assume that he's going to score each week, but he is seeing desirable matchups week in and week out of the slot. He's a solid bench player to have during this bye week period. Drop Jahan Dotson. I think one of the biggest surprises of this fantasy season is Jahan Dotson's lack of performance. If he finishes like a wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4, it would be disappointing, but it wouldn't be that big of a surprise. He was basically being drafted as a wide receiver 3. But right now, Dotson's more like a wide receiver 6 or a wide receiver 7. Now, he's had an identical target share to Curtis Samuel this year, but he's been way less productive. And after seeing target shares of just 10.4% and 4.8% over his last 2 games, I understand that it's getting very difficult to keep holding on to Jahan Dotson. And then on top of that, Washington wide receivers won't have it easy from now through the end of the year. They have a bottom 10 schedule according to adjusted fantasy points allowed. And they've got one of the worst playoff schedules that you can find. Curtis Samuel right now is at least giving us something. That's why he's an ad. Dotson just doesn't have that much going for him. All that he has going for him is how we felt before the season started. That he was a really talented wide receiver who could potentially break out this year. But as it stands through 6 weeks, that breakout clearly isn't happening. If you're in a shallower format, definitely a 10 or an 8-team league, but maybe even a 12-team league, you can drop Jahan Dotson. Hold Marvin Mims. Now look, I sit on my couch and I watch football every Sunday, just like you do. And just like you, I'm critical of what coaches are doing. But I understand, I'm not the one who's coaching that team. I don't want to be overly critical when I'm not the one making those decisions. But there's one thing I will be overly critical about, and that's Sean Payton's usage of Marvin Mims. Mims is second on the Broncos right now in receiving yards. That's after 6 weeks. He's only run 51 routes, and he's second on the team in receiving yards. For some context, Marvin Mims, 51 routes run, Cortland Sutton, 185 routes run, Jerry Jeudy, 142 routes run. Among all players in the league with 50-plus routes run, Marvin Mims trails only Tyreek Hill in yards per route run. I know you're sick of hearing about this. I know the production is not matching. It's just absolutely crazy that this guy can't find the field more. The Broncos were horrible in week 6, and Marvin Mims ran 7 routes. Despite all of this, right now is not the time to drop Marvin Mims, because the Jerry Jeudy trade rumors are really strong. And if a deal gets done, that could truly unleash Marvin Mims. I'd probably even consider Mims a buy candidate right now. So definitely don't drop him. Add Jordan Mason and Elijah Mitchell. So Christian McCaffrey left San Francisco's Week 6 game against Cleveland with an oblique injury. Fortunately, though, Twitter doctors don't seem to think that it's that serious. But as we know, anything can happen with injuries. There's still a chance that he could miss Week 7. And if he does, Jordan Mason and Elijah Mitchell are going to have to step up. Mason ended up playing 15 snaps to Mitchell's 7 in Week 6, but Mitchell was also coming off of an injury of his own. I think if you were to look at both of these running backs, Mason would be the guy to prioritize over Mitchell, just given our most recent sample. But I think that if CMC misses time, we're looking at a split backfield. But regardless, given how efficient this San Francisco offense is, you should be adding these guys this week because of this CMC injury. Buy Brock Purdy. So speaking of the 49ers, I think that you can go after Brock Purdy this week too. He scored just 7.7 standard fantasy points in Week 6. That was the first time in his career that he failed to hit 14 fantasy points while throwing the ball 20 or more times in a game. But it came against one of the best defenses in football with two of his biggest weapons sidelined with injury. Because Deebo Samuel was hurt in that game too. Brock Purdy's going to bounce back. And he could bounce back in a big way. Not only do the 49ers get a more favorable matchup this week against Minnesota, but San Francisco quarterbacks currently have the second best schedule from here on out, according to adjusted fantasy points allowed. And in 2 of their 3 playoff matchups, they'll get the Cardinals and the Commanders. Now, I don't think Brock Purdy is going to be a high-end QB1 in fantasy football, but a high-end QB2, maybe even a low-end QB1, absolutely in his range of outcomes. Add Craig Reynolds. David Montgomery landed awkwardly on the ball on Sunday. He hurt his ribs as a result, and that could sideline him. And that would lead to more Craig Reynolds in this Lions offense. Now, the last time we saw Montgomery miss a game, that was back in Week 3, the Detroit backfield saw Jahmyr Gibbs with a 68% running back rush share. He carried the ball 17 times. Meanwhile, Reynolds essentially split the remaining backfield touches with Zonovan Knight, with Bam Knight. The thing is, Knight's now out for the season with a shoulder injury. And Gibbs hasn't been able to play the last couple of weeks with a bad hamstring. So if Montgomery misses time, Reynolds would see an uptick in work. He saw 18 snaps on Sunday when the third stringer Devine Ezigbo, he saw 6. Now, if Jahmyr Gibbs is back, Gibbs would be the 1A in that offense. He would see the most work. But if Gibbs isn't back, then we're talking about Craig Reynolds being the lead back in this Detroit backfield. He's definitely worth an add this week. Add Michael Mayer. From weeks 1 through 4, Raiders tight ends had a target share of 5.3%. That was by far the lowest in the NFL. Over the last 2 weeks, that number's been 21.7%. And Michael Mayer, the rookie from Notre Dame, he's the one who's benefited most from that change. He's seen target shares of 10.3% and 19.4% over his last 2. He had a tight end 1 performance this past week, catching 5 balls for 75 yards. I know a lot of us are struggling at tight end, so Michael Mayer's worth an add. Buy Puka Nacua. Look, I'll be honest, I don't know how every Puka Nacua manager is feeling after his Week 6 dud. Anyone who has Nacua probably loves Puka Nacua. It's almost impossible not to. This transaction is to essentially say that Puka Nacua and his peripherals this past week were absolutely fine. Yeah, he scored 6.6 PPR points. Yeah, it wasn't a great game. And yeah, it was a game when Cooper Kupp was back. He was active. You can make that correlation all you want. You can say that Cooper Kupp was back and Puka Nacua didn't perform very well. But guess what? Nacua had a 33.3% target share. That was his 3rd best target share of the entire season. And that was with Cooper Kupp. It's just that the Rams didn't throw the ball that much. And Nacua ended up with just 7 targets as a result. But the fact that I'm saying just 7 targets, that tells you all you need to know. Puka Nacua is just fine. He's going to perform better moving forward. Add Dalton Schultz. So like Michael Mayer, another tight end who's seen an increase in work over the last couple of weeks is Dalton Schultz. From weeks 1 through 4, Schultz's target share per game rate was just 11.8%. His last 2 games have seen him with target shares of 31.3% and 29.2%. Regardless of how good Dalton Schultz is, that absolutely needs to be rostered. And he's still out there in about half of Yahoo leagues. So he deserves a shout this week. Buy Bijan Robinson. So I can't imagine that a lot of Bijan Robinson managers are ready to move on after his week 6 performance. But his back-to-back games with a sub 50% running back rush share, it might be scaring people off. It's at least a very tilting experience because it is frustrating. As underrated as Tyler Algier has been since entering the NFL, he's not Bijan Robinson. In fact, on the year, Algier trails Robinson in expected points added per rush, success rate, and rushing yards over expected per carry. And maybe this is just how things are going to go. I talked about this a little bit on last week's mailbag episode. But maybe Robinson's 46.7% running back rush share over the last 2 weeks, that's how it is. That's what we're going to see. The thing is, even if that's the case, even if things remain the exact same, he's still not a bad fantasy asset. He's now scored 10 plus PPR points in every game this year. That's because he has a 16.3% target share. And look, even though we're a couple months away, Atlanta's running back schedule in the fantasy playoffs is amazing. They get the Panthers, Colts, and Bears during weeks 15 through 17. Those are all top 10 matchups for running backs. So again, even if Robinson's backfield share remains the exact same, he can still be productive. We've already seen him be productive, but there's still upside with his volume. And in the fantasy football playoffs, when things matter most, his efficiency could go through the roof too. So if anyone in your league is open to trading away Bijan Robinson, you should jump on it. Add Zach Evans. Kyren Williams has a minor ankle injury, and that could sideline him week 7 against Pittsburgh. And then meanwhile, backup Ronnie Rivers has a PCL sprain that's going to keep him off the field for 4 to 5 weeks. That leaves the Rams' backfield to rookie Zach Evans. Now, Evans was a back who had a pretty big following this offseason during draft season. I know a lot of you guys aren't listening during that time, but a lot of smart people like Zach Evans as a prospect. My prospect model didn't totally love him because he had a best season reception share of just 5%. But that model's not right all the time. And he had a hard time staying healthy in college. And he also played with some really good running backs. That can lower a player's production. Considering how the Rams have given Kyren Williams such a great workload this season, there's always a chance that they do the same with Zach Evans if Williams misses this week. Or if he misses even longer. And what if Zach Evans shows up? What if he has a great game? Then all of a sudden we're talking about this rookie running back who hasn't had an opportunity this year. We're talking about him potentially digging into Kyren Williams' workload moving forward. Now, do I think that that's the probable outcome? Absolutely not. Do I think it's possible? Sure. And off the waiver wire, we're adding what's possible. Add the Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense. We finally have pretty good streaming defenses here in week 7. You could look at the Rams against the Steelers, the Commanders against the Giants, the Raiders against the Bears if they're still available, or even the Seahawks against the Cardinals. But I'm going to talk about the Buccaneers here because they're available in a lot of leagues right now. They get Atlanta in week 7. The Falcons are a top 10 team for fantasy defenses and adjusted fantasy points allowed. They've given up 4 more sacks in 4 of 6 games this year. And this game, according to FanDuel Sportsbook, has a sub 40 point over under with the Bucs as 2.5 point home favorites. So the Buccaneers make plenty of sense this week as a streaming defense. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I got the 10 Trends episode for you tomorrow. I'll talk to you then.